General Christopher Cavoli, who's the commander of American ground forces in Europe, commander of NATO ground forces, said back in 2023, early 2023, that NATO couldn't imagine the scope of violence that's taking place, the destruction that's taking place in this battle. What that means when you say can't imagine, it means we don't have plans in place to deal with modern warfare because we didn't imagine. A plan is what you've imagined is going to happen and how you're going to deal with what you've imagined. But if you're thinking that when you go to war, that your attrition rate will be 3% a day, so you build your logistical sustainability plan on that attrition rate, when reality is your attrition rate may be 60% a day. And now you don't have sustainability. It means NATO can't go to war. NATO can't do this kind of combat. That's the reality. Our military is not ready to fight this kind of fight, but perhaps even more important, the American people aren't ready for this. Are we ready for 5,000 body bags a day? I don't think we are. But that's what's going to happen if we go to war in Ukraine. Full-scale war against the Russians.
Hello and welcome to our latest war update on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where Russia continues to assert its dominance. And in this video, we'll be dissecting the most recent developments from the ongoing Russian advances to the desperate countermeasures of Ukraine and the West. Now, as Mr. Scott Ritter has pointed out many times, the truth of a conflict is far from what the Western media portrays. Ritter, who's been one of the few voices exposing the West's failures, has made it clear that Russia's strategic superiority is undeniable. Buckle up, folks, because as always, we're bringing the truth they won't tell you in the mainstream media. First up, let's talk about Zaporizhzhia. The Russians are not just sitting back, folks, they're moving forward. Yesterday, they unleashed a relentless barrage of artillery on the city, causing extensive damage. Over 25 high-precision strikes were launched on strategic locations, hitting everything from supply depots to military communication centers. As Scott Ritter has consistently warned, the Ukrainian forces here are in no position to defend themselves effectively. Their stretch lines are vulnerable to Russia's precision strikes, which Ritter has described as systematically dismantling Ukraine's ability to fight back. And doesn't end there. The Russian forces have expanded their control northward into Nesterinka and roboting two critical zones that once formed part of Ukraine's defensive barrier. The strategic importance of these areas cannot be overstated. By pushing, Russia is tightening its grip on the surrounding regions, potentially cutting off Ukrainian reinforcements and logistics. The local population, well, they're either fleeing in panic or being evacuated by Ukrainian forces who seem more concerned with saving their own skins. Meanwhile, Russian forces are reported to be as far as 15 kilometers deep into Ukrainian-held territory at certain points. Now, let's talk numbers. Ukrainian forces are stretched thin, with fewer than 20,000 combat-ready troops in the Zaporizhzhia region. Compare that to the over 45,000 Russian troops in the area, and it's no wonder we're seeing such a rapid collapse of Ukrainian defensive lines. Russian forces have employed over 300 heavy artillery units, 150 tanks, and nearly 100 rocket systems to pound Ukrainian positions relentlessly. It's a staggering show of force. And on top of that, Russian electronic warfare units have effectively jammed Ukrainian communications in over 80% of the Zaporizhzhia sector. Now, Ukraine is quickly running out of options here. The 20,000 soldiers they have stationed in the region are grossly outnumbered and outgunned. We know, thanks to insiders, that Ukraine has lost more than 1,000 pieces of heavy equipment over the past few months alone, including tankles and artillery pieces. The West's much lauded military aid has hardly helped. In fact, Western equipment now accounts for over 70% of Ukrainian battlefield losses. Let that sink in. Billions of dollars of Western support destroyed in a matter of days. The Ukrainian supply lines are disintegrating as well. In just the last 2 weeks, over 150 Ukrainian supply trucks have been destroyed, disrupting the flow of food, fuel, and ammunition. This is crippling Ukraine's ability to fight on the front lines. They're not just losing soldiers and equipment, they're losing the very infrastructure that keeps them in the fight. But for now, let's head over to south, where the battle for Donetsk rages on. Next, we turn to the southern front, where the Russian forces have been making steady progress in Donetsk. In Nam Donetsk, the Russians have gradually expanded their control westward towards Staromlynivka. As Scott Ritter has observed, this is a prime example of Russia's strategy of grinding down the enemy. Ritter has highlighted the importance of controlling logistics and supply routes, and that's exactly what the Russians are doing here. It may not seem like a huge leap forward at first glance, but these small, steady advances represent a strategic tightening of the noose around Ukrainian forces, with over 30,000 Russian troops in the area, compared to Ukraine's 15,000. It's clear who's holding the upper hand. This is no random movement, this is tactical brilliance. By pulling their forces in tighter, the Russians are setting up for a major offensive aimed at cutting off Ukraine's supply lines. Ukrainian troops are frantically trying to hold their positions, but with Russian firepower closing in from multiple directions, it's only a matter of time before they lose their grip on key areas like Bohaivanka and Novomikhailivka. And we're talking about cutting off critical logistical routes that Ukraine needs to survive. Over 500 kilometers of supply routes have already been compromised by Russian advances. In fact, reports from the ground suggest that Ukrainian units are losing up to 60% of their incoming supplies due to Russian strikes on convoys and warehouses. Just this week alone, over 100 supply convoys were ambushed or destroyed, causing widespread shortages across the front lines. And what is Ukraine's response? They're relying on outdated Western artillery and armored vehicles that stand no chance against Russian precision strikes. The more than 30 NATO supplied howitzers were obliterated this past week alone. That's right, minus 30 howitzers gone just like that. The Ukrainians are scrambling to repair what they can. But with the Russians controlling over 60% of the airspace in the region, those efforts are increasingly in vain. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is failing, and the numbers back it up. In the last 2 months alone, Ukraine has lost over 3,000 soldiers in the Donetsk region, and nearly 5,000 are considered missing or wounded. Now, this is a catastrophic failure for the Ukrainian military, no matter how much Western media tries to spin it. And speaking of failed offensives, let's zoom in on Volodar, where things are going from bad to worse for Ukraine. Volodar, where the clock is ticking. Russian forces are closing in on this once strong Ukrainian stronghold, and it's only a matter of days before it completely falls. Russian forces now control over 40% of the town, with Ukrainian forces reduced to less than 3,000 troops, mostly inexperienced conscripts, sent to hold the line. Now, the situation has gotten so desperate, Ukraine has had to call back soldiers who were previously wounded just to try and reinforce their numbers. The Russians are relentless. Artillery, airstrikes, and even thermobaric weapons have been deployed to pound Ukrainian defensive positions into submission. Over 50 Russian airstrikes were conducted in the past 24 hours alone, killing more than 500 Ukrainian soldiers and injuring another 300. That's nearly 30% of their remaining force wiped out in a single day. This isn't heroism, folks, this desperation at its peak. Ukrainian forces are now using underground bunkers and tunnels to hide from Russian bombardment. But that only delays the inevitable, and the Russians have systematically targeted the underground infrastructure that Ukraine relies on. Tunnels have been bombed, supply routes have been cut off, and entire bunkers have been obliterated. We've already seen over 50 airstrikes specifically targeting these tunnels, cutting off escape routes, and causing structural collapses. Russian forces are methodically eroding their defenses, and with the death toll rising every day, the Ukrainian command is running out of soldiers willing or able to fight, and once Russia will gain full control over key logistical hubs and supply lines connecting to the south. Ukraine's southern defenses will be shattered, and with over 300 kilometers of territory already under Russian control in this sector, Ukrainian forces will have little choice but to retreat further west, abandoning even more critical infrastructure. Now, let's head further north where Russia's air dominance is making all the difference in Kupiansk. Kupiansk in the northeastern sector has been a hotbed of action as Russian forces have expanded their control around Kyiv and bombarded key Ukrainian positions in the city. The Ukrainians are taking heavy losses, and we've got video proof of Russian airstrikes destroying crucial Eurostender strongholds. Over 30 airstrikes were conducted in just the last 48 hours, targeting command posts, ammunition depots, and frontline positions. Scott Ritter has repeatedly pointed out that Russian air dominance has been a game changer in this conflict, and here we're seeing exactly what he meant. Ritter stated that Ukraine's inability to establish air superiority has left them vulnerable to Russia's devastating aerial assaults. And the numbers don't lie, folks. Ukrainian forces have lost over 800 soldiers and 25 armored vehicles just in this sector over the past week. That's on top of 20 artillery pieces, 12 mortars, and multiple ammunition dumps that have been reduced to rubble. Ukrainian air defenses have been virtually non-existent, with only 3% of their missile systems still operational in the area. Russian drones and jets are dominating the skies, ensuring that no defensive position is safe for long. The total Ukrainian death toll in Kupiansk alone has reached over 1,200 in the last week. That's a 10% reduction in Ukrainian forces in this area in just 7 days. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue to strengthen their positions, with over 500 kilometers of Ukrainian territory now under their control in the northeast. It's not just about capturing land, it's about demoralizing the enemy, and Ukraine is bleeding soldiers at a rate they simply cannot sustain. So while the skies belong to Russia, let's dive into the latest strategic updates from Donetsk, where another breakthrough is on the horizon. Moving back to Donetsk, we're seeing yet another strategic masterstroke by Russia. The Russian forces have successfully advanced past the railway near Volodar and seized critical defensive positions in the north around Kryvyi Rih, Krasnoyarsk, and Okryeli. Over 5,000 Ukrainian troops are now effectively surrounded, with no clear path for reinforcement or retreat. And the Ukrainian forces, once well entrenched, are now exposed on all sides. Ukraine in command has already begun moving artillery and armored units away from the front line, knowing full well that any further engagement could lead to catastrophic losses. We're talking about artillery batteries and nearly 50 armored vehicles that have been forced to retreat, leaving their infantry isolated and vulnerable. The net is closing, folks. Russian artillery has been pounding these areas, cutting off Ukrainian escape routes, while Russian ground forces tighten the noose. The question now isn't whether Ukraine can hold, they can't. The question is how many soldiers will Ukraine lose before they're forced to surrender these positions completely. Ukrainian leadership is facing impossible choices: risk total annihilation or retreat yet again. Speaking of desperation, let's shift gears to Washington, where the US is still pouring money into a conflict they can't seem to win. Ah yes, the great Western saviors pouring in billions of taxpayer dollars into Ukraine, only to watch it all crumble. Just this past week, Biden announced another $8 billion aid package, adding to the $113 billion already sent. But what's to show for it? Over 70% of U.supplied weapons been destroyed or captured by Russian forces, and Ukraine is still losing ground over 2,000 square kilometers in just the last 3 months. While the West burns through money, Russia is solidifying its alliances, with 30,000 Russian and Belarusian troops ready to defend their borders, and China and Brazil standing firm with Moscow. The West's attempts to isolate Russia are failing miserably. As Scott Ritter points out, this conflict is shifting global power. Russia is gaining while Ukraine and the West fall behind. As Ritter said, this isn't just a war, it's a new global reality. Stay tuned for more updates, and we'll see you on the other side of the front line. Thank you for tuning into this update. Stay strong, stay in the sucked, and as always, we'll see you on the other side of the front line.